Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I am the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and this is the Bloomberg Opinion Politics live stream. And I'm here today with two of my friends and colleagues, Frank Wilkinson and Nia Malika Henderson. I think I'm with them almost all the time now in this strange world that we live in. They are both political columnists. They're both insightful. And we're here today to talk about the vice presidential debate that aired last night. As always, we can take questions from our audience, just put them into the feed, and our producer, Michael Johnson, will pick them up and put them in front of us if we can answer them. Okay, friends, I thought that debate was a big sort of nothing burger. Feel free to disagree with me. I have a feeling you won't. But we can parse why it was a nothing burger. But Nia, I want to start with you. There was a lot of observations around this as one of the virtues of the debate was it was Midwestern nice. The candidates attempted to talk about substance. They weren't landing a lot of personal barbs on one another. It certainly was very different from any Donald Trump debate we've had to witness. But is Midwestern nice a good debate strategy?
No, it turns out that I felt like the debate was boring. I can imagine many millions of Americans, to the extent that anybody tuned in, tuning out pretty quickly at the top of the debate. I couldn't tell going in what Waltz's strategy was in particular. He was clearly nervous in the beginning of the debate. The campaign telegraphed that he would be nervous. Here he was debating a Yale-trained lawyer. So you could tell he was out of his depth and sort of unsteady, particularly with the foreign policy question. I expected Vance to be much, much better than he was and to have a real strategy of tearing down in a memorable way, full of sound bites, full of zingers, going at Kamala Harris. That JD Vance didn't really show up. The JD Vance that did show up was one who clearly wanted to repair his image, particularly among women. They see the gender gap here. They know that he's known for sort of the childless cat lady comments and not emoting, not having real empathy. So you saw him there repeatedly calling the moderators by their names: Margaret, Margaret, Nora, Margaret, Margaret, reminding him, reminding the audience that he had kids, that he had a wife, that he had a mom, he was birthed to a mom, and he had a grandma. And so that was clearly his strategy. If you look at some of the reactions to the debate on cable news from focus group folks, it seems like it was sort of a draw, which I think if you're Tim Walz, who is not a good debater, if you got a draw with jail-trained lawyer, that's pretty good. I thought at times JD Vance comes across as kind of smarmy, right? You can just sort of see him, laugh here, smile here. There is a sort of mechanical effect to his performance of politics. He also comes off as just a lecturer, right? Part of debates is communicating, and you do that by having a conversation. For JD Vance, I thought he was basically taking parts of his stump speech and just presenting them. And in that way, I thought he felt flat. And I think that's why it sort of seemed policy heavy, that Tim Walz was not good. But JD Vance also, I didn't think, performed as well as he could in connecting to voters and connecting with this idea of really tearing down Kamala Harris in a memorable way. Listen, I think to the extent people tuned in, they probably tuned out quickly, and it probably didn't move the needle very much.
Yeah, Nia, the Politico this morning mentioned one of their Insta polls, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but that independents watching the debate um, leaned much more heavily towards Walz than Vance in terms of their reactions to the debate. But the reality was that very few independents were probably watching the debate to begin with.
Yeah.
So whether or not that's a useful data point is debatable, no pun intended. Probably none of that surprises you, Frank. You wrote a very good curtain raiser for Bloomberg Opinion that we published yesterday morning about I think sort of a reality check on all the anticipation around this debate and whether or not it would really be momentous or pivotal or any of those things people sometimes expect out of these things.
Well, first of all, I'm pleased to report that I have a slight agreement with Nia for a change. So that's good. We have a debate. I
Yes.
actually thought Vance was pretty good. I think, a vice presidential debate typically, strategically, is about the number twos attacking the opposite number ones, right? That's the purpose of it, to tear down the other president, because people are not really voting for vice president. They're voting for president. They don't have the mental space to care what, JD Vance's background is too much, or whether Walz was a good governor of Minnesota or not. That's not what they're concerned with. They're concerned with the principle, which is the presidential candidate. Vance was much more effective in going after Harris than Walz was going after Trump. Number one, I would say. Number two, Trump is such a garbage barge of attacks himself that Vance, I don't think, needed to come off as an attack dog. That was probably a good decision on his part. He looked very reasonable. He was very calm. He did not get upset. He did not say outlandish things about cat ladies and how women who don't have children really are not very important in American society. He really restrained all the stuff that Walz and Harris have defined as weird, right? So he was less weird.
Nothing about pet eating.
Nothing about pet eating migrants in Ohio. No. So he was way less weird. He was way more reasonable. He was a much better debater than Walz, first of all, just in terms of a coherent. He was dishonest frequently, but he was very coherent. And so I think Vance did very well for himself and did pretty well for Trump too, because the one of the concerns that voters have about Trump is his volatility and instability, right? Or volatility, rather, and instability. So Vance was the opposite of that. He was quite calm, quite measured. He may not have been very honest, but most people are not going to pick that up, I don't think. And I think that Walz, by contrast, was, rattled from the very beginning. He was not very effective in arguing against Trump, and he was not very coherent a lot of the time. He didn't have a subject verb in the right place in a lot of his sentences. It was kind of unclear what the subject of the sentence was. So I think that Vance, to the extent that he set out to succeed in that debate, I think that he probably did.
And I think that he was, he presented as the way that some of Trump's handlers have wanted Trump to present on a debate stage. But it's impossible to actually program Donald Trump to be reasonable and normative. But they clearly did program JD Vance to get there, and I do think he pulled that off. And I agree with you that Walz, I think, came across for the most part very poorly. He just didn't look properly prepared, and he constantly, to me, looked like somebody playing pinball and seeing tilt warnings up on the screen all the time. Let's cut to Walz being asked about whether or not he was actually in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989.
The question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests, went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
Yeah. And this answer was after... Yeah, this answer was after a 2-minute answer.
Yeah,
answer to the same question. This was his probably worst moment of the debate, summing up, I think, a sort of deer in the headlights look that he had often throughout the debate. There were times I thought he sort of hit his stride, but for the most part, he was nervous. He was meandering to the extent that, again, they want to portray Walz specifically and the whole ticket as radical and out of touch, the sort of agreeing with him on any number of issues. really undercut that idea that Vance and Trump are radicals and threats to women's rights and gun safety. So, yeah, I mean, and I think I agree mostly with what Frank is saying. I do think Tim Walz was bad. I just don't think that Vance comes across in a sort of empathetic way. I don't think the average voter really can relate to him. I think he comes off as a phony, right? You could sort of see the strings to what he was doing. And to the extent that, what he was really trying to do was soften his image, humanize himself, particularly with women. I think he came across as sort of a sort of a jerk, right? Who in some ways patronizing, sort of condescending, talking down to people. There was all these times when he was like, well, let me tell you what's really going on here, right? Sort of, I'm sort of mansplaining to the viewer. That's how he came across to me. Listen, I think obviously it may have worked for some voters. We'll see in some of, to the extent that they do focus groups or polling on this. But that's how he came across to me, as sort of the jerk in the class who is always raising his hand and possibly hasn't even read the book. That's how he came across to me. But again, other people may have liked it.
Well, in that context, let's take a look at a clip of Vance explaining where he stands on abortion.
She felt like if she hadn't had that abortion, that it would have destroyed her life because she was in an abusive relationship. My party, we've got to do so much better of a job at earning the American people's trust back on this issue where they frankly just don't trust us. And I think that's one of the things that Donald Trump and I are endeavoring to do. I want us as a Republican Party to be pro-family in the fullest sense of the word. I want us to support fertility treatments. I want us to make it easier for moms to afford to have babies. I want it to make it easier for young families to afford a home so they can afford a place to raise that family.
So, Nia, our friend J.D. Vance is actually not saying anything about where he stands on ensuring that women have reproductive rights fully realized and access to abortion as they need it on demand. He actually finished his statement about why his party is so off on abortion by saying they should encourage women to have more babies. Mm-hmm. And he said all of this in a very smooth and car salesman-ish way. But he still wasn't answering the question, and he wasn't actually getting at the central problem of why Republicans are having such trouble with abortion as an issue and how it's defining their relationship with women voters.
Yeah, and it's sort of nonsense. This idea of we need to gain Americans' trust on this issue. I don't even understand what that means. But again, it's sort of his smooth talking, sort of papering over where that ticket is, where Republicans are, which is very radical, which is this idea that if you're in Mississippi, you don't have rights over your own body, but if you're in California, you do. I mean, that is the position of Vance and Trump. But again, it's up to Walz, right? Because they didn't have the benefit here of moderators who were fact checking. So it's up to Walz, right, to come in and actually lay out what the reality is. And he did that. I mean, to the extent that he had any good moment, I think sort of the abortion response was a good one. The democracy stuff at the end, probably nobody was watching by that point. But the interesting thing about J.D. Vance is he was picked for this ticket, partly because of his television performance, right? He is this sort of cable news guy. He can go on and sound smooth in those, 5-minute bites. I think over 90 minutes, it doesn't really work because he has no expression on his face, whether or not he's talking about his own children or if he's talking about folks who are here, who are migrants. So that, I think, it doesn't work on television, right? I think he was trying to connect with the viewer by connecting with Margaret and Nora. And oh, thanks for that question, Margaret. But it didn't really work because his words don't connect with his face, right? There's no sort of emoting. There's no sense of inflection or attachment to what he's actually saying. So I think that just doesn't wear very well over 90 minutes. I clearly have watched too much TV in my
Join the club, Nia. You know, around what Nia was just saying about Vance and his veneer, Frank, it did get pierced a couple of times. One of the moments that was notable to me was when Margaret Brennan pointed out that the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were there legally, et cetera, et cetera, and Vance interrupted her and said, "Hey, the rules," something to the effect of, "Hey, the rules were that you guys weren't supposed to fact check." And it's always interesting to me when politicians don't like facts or find it offensive when they're asked to talk about facts. And the second thing that's compelling to me about that, however, is that Margaret Brennan, when she had the opportunity, was doing some of the follow-ups that Tim Walz himself wasn't doing. I think they had 2 rounds of immigration questions before Walz finally brought up Springfield, which has been a very good national talking point for Democrats on this. Trump famously said during his debate with Kamala Harris that Haitian migrants in Springfield are eating people's pets. Not true. Trump was part of a kind of poisonous cycle that circulated on social media. It's curious to me why Walz didn't make more of that about immigration. And then we can also talk about why he didn't make more of guns, Frank.
Well, I think you could go down a list, including abortion, that he did not make more of. I mean, the reason that J.D. Vance is talking, once again, I'm a little bit off from Nia on this, so I'm very pleased we're disagreeing. But Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have an extremely unpopular position on abortion. Women are dying as a result of Republican policies on abortion. This is a horrific issue for them for good reason. They are against the majority of Americans, and their policies are having horrific consequences in real life. So, given that, he talks about something else, right? Because you don't want to talk about the facts when the facts are that much arrayed against you. Now, Springfield, I think, is a little different because they're talking about that still in some ways because they want to keep hammering this idea. You saw over and over again. What's the housing problem in America? Housing problem in America apparently is that there are too many immigrants. Name a problem, and the answer is that there are too many immigrants, according to J.D. Vance. So, sticking to that kind of language is not an entire negative for them. Yes, they lied about Springfield, Ohio, up and down. They still are lying about it. Trump went ahead and he lied about some other Haitian immigrants in Pennsylvania. I mean, this is what they do. But they're doing it for a reason because they think it works for them. And it certainly works for them better than talking about abortion, which doesn't work under any circumstances. And I thought, Vance sort of moving that to, gee, we've lost the trust of people on this. Well, why have you lost the trust? Because your policies are outrageous and people oppose them. So, rather than getting to the heart of the issue based on facts, having this sort of emotive, gosh, we have to do better about this, even though our policies are abhorrent, I think was as good as you were going to get if you were J.D. Vance.
And Nia, do you think any women voters are going to take that at face value? Is he getting away with this, or is it worked for a 90-minute debate and it's never going to work again?
I just listen. I don't speak for all women. Obviously, Republican women and some of those folks are much more anti-abortion. I just thought it came out off as sort of smarmy and who do you think you are, right? We're going to listen and figure, we'll be more understanding on this fundamental issue. It just sounded kind of false and I mean, again, it could work, because the idea is to come across as moderate. It was his attempt at sounding like a compassionate conservative. But the reality, women and men have lived in the reality of a post-Dobbs America. And you saw Tim Walz there mentioned Amber Thurman, a woman who died in Georgia because of the lack of abortion access and some of the confusion around some of these laws. And he mentioned Hadley Duvall, who was 12 and raped by her stepfather, and under these circumstances probably couldn't have gotten an abortion easily. So yeah, I mean, I think it just comes off as sort of entitled, as removed from the problem, and just sort of false sincerity, right? And it was clearly a line. It was, I thought, a bit paternalistic too. And I thought that was kind of his whole effects through the whole thing. There was kind of this talking down and a sort of, I'm here, but oh, I have this friend who got an abortion. And at some point, again, he's trying to emote. He says, love ya, which I don't, it's this sort of practiced storytelling that I thought came across as phony. But again, I definitely agree with Frank that it was more coherent, it was more polished, but I think it veered often into the sort of tacky car salesman effect. And I grew up watching a lot of televangelists because I grew up very religious, and that's what it reminded me of. That's what his performance kind of reminded me of, which can be very effective to a certain group of people. Yeah, exactly.
Frank, the airwaves and the internets this morning were talking about how substantive this debate was and that they focused so much on policy. And I found that somewhat jarring, as I said in the top of our discussion today, because I felt they actually danced around policy without really battling out the ways in which good policy gets made and the ways in which policy affects average folks in America. And that really struck me on guns. Vance identified the problem as drug cartels in Mexico who were sneaking, container loads of guns into the United States and causing violence. Walz came back at that by saying that actually, let's just stay focused on the guns themselves and not how they got here. We all have children. We all worry about our children in schools. And then they actually kind of had Vance and Walz a sort of bonding around this. Walz noting that they're both gun owners, they both care about their children, et cetera, et cetera. But, I don't think they actually really hashed out the difficult and brutal and murderous realities that are still with us around guns.
Well, if you're having a discussion that includes Vance's statement that Mexican cartels are running guns into the United States, when the reality is that American guns are being run into Mexico, it's literally upside down. The problem with guns in the United States, including illegal guns in the United States, is not that they are coming from Mexico.
Exactly.
They're being stolen out of people's cars because people are careless. They're being stolen from, other criminals. I mean, they're being
legally purchased on street corners.
They're being legally purchased by people who shouldn't have them. Yes.
Yeah.
So that was another instance where I think Walz just did not have the wherewithal to sort of lay out a coherent argument about why gun policy in the U.S., especially in red states, Ohio included, are insane and are causing people's deaths. To say it was about policy, well, I guess it was, except, it began with this ridiculous lie about Mexico running guns into the U.S. and really just ended up with this sort of joint empathy about it's terrible that kids are being shot. That's not a policy debate. That's something you might say to somebody at a bar over a beer when you don't know them and you don't want to actually expose what you really think. It's not a substantive discussion. And I think that really, if you look at where policy is and the fact that Democrats for the most part, have more popular policies than Republicans. So that falls on Walz to make that case. Vance's job is to obscure that, right? Which he tried to do with abortion, being smarmy as whatever, but he's trying to obscure the positions because they're not popular. Walz's job is to rip that, cover away and say, no, here's what the real deal is. And he was really not able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And well, and the through line, for Vance a number of times were the evil migrants.
Mhm.
We have a housing problem because there are too many immigrants in the United States, so we need mass deportation. We have a gun problem because we have a porous border, and the cartels and migrants are bringing these things into the country, and therefore immigration and migrants are the problem. Nia, I cut you off there. Tell me what you were
Yeah,
about to
no,
say.
I mean, definitely a missed opportunity for Walz because Vance was basically saying if we had better locks in these schools and hardened doors and more security guards, then that's the solution. But there, unfortunately, America's littered with examples of security guards being there, right, and not acting quickly enough, being outgunned by
Uvalde, Texas.
exactly. So it was sort of an easy comeback based on the lived experiences that these kids and parents have had in these awful instances. And Waltz just he couldn't marshal the facts, couldn't marshal a coherent argument. It's funny because I talked to our colleague Patricia about the debate before the debate, and she was very uh, high on the idea that Tim Walz would be terrible, right? That she has covered him. She knows that in these press conferences, for instance, there's often
This is Patricia Lopez, who's
Patricia
based in
Lopez.
Minnesota and has
Yeah,
covered Waltz for a number of years.
there's a deer in the headlights look. There are rambling answers. You could tape him for an hour and get, one coherent quote. And that's kind of what we saw. The sort of surprise to her was the more polished, more pithy, more soundbite cable news Waltz that we all saw initially with the whole weird thing. But again, in short sound bites, he was able to do well. But she was not surprised at all that that's the Waltz that showed up, because that's the Waltz that she covered. And listen, they sort of telegraphed, yeah, he's nervous. He's going against a Yale trained lawyer. And sure enough, that Waltz that Patricia knows very well showed up.
Well, so we've spent a lot of time treating Tim Walz like a pinata, and I frankly think he deserves to be treated like one today. But I want to also focus on what I thought was one of his strongest moments during the debate. We have a clip where he actually challenges J.D. Vance to come clean about the 2020 election. Let's take a look at that.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
I thought that was great, and Tim Waltz is speaking on behalf of I think any American who believes in democracy doesn't think that fomenting an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in January of 2020 was a good thing. And J.D. Vance's response, that is, I'm focused on the future. Well, that future includes bringing Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's calculus back into the White House with, I would assume, to be equally destructive designs on democracy. I was glad that Waltz raised this. I thought he did well there, Frank. But what was your take?
Well, I guess I have two takes. I agree with you. Waltz delivered that perfectly as a performance. The problem is the existence of that clip exposes the entire debate as a sham. We have this form of democracy, right, where two people are debating in public, they're having a public discussion. But the reality is that one of the parties has decided that they don't care what the rules are, and they don't care what the vote tally is. They're going to try to seize power anyway, and that's okay. So the entire moment rendered the debate a sham because it's a democratic debate with a non-democratic participant. You can't say I'm happy to have this discussion about policy because people need to, have information when they go to the polls and they decide who wins the election. If your end result is, I don't care who wins the election, I get to seize power if I lose the election. So I thought that it was a powerful moment, certainly, but it was a very, very depressing moment as well about the state of democracy right now. And the fact that, we just went through 90 minutes with this guy pretending that he's part of a democratic system, part of a democratic norm, part of a democratic, institution, which these debates are. And then basically, if things don't go the way I want, we're going to throw that out the window and we'll try to seize power.
Yeah, just to put a pin in that, Nia, at one point, Vance spoke up around this topic again, and I'm not quoting him. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he said something to the effect of, "It's really rich to say that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy when he oversaw a peaceful transfer of power." Like anyone, you can just run the January 6th video to take note of the fact that it certainly didn't look like a peaceful transfer of power.
No, and listen, what allowed him to do that was that CBS News and those journalists decided that he would get a free pass, right? That they would not really engage in much fact checking at all in this debate. And when they did, he said, "Oh, I thought you weren't going to fact check." So, the moderators played a role, I think, in enabling this person who is anti-democratic, who doesn't believe in the same values that many Americans do around democracy and the peaceful transfer of power. They allowed that. They allowed him to do that because they basically just said, we're just going to be the platform. We're not going to be fact checkers. We're not going to be truthful. We're going to be neutral, essentially. And you saw the difference in the ABC debate with fact checking on both sides. And so this is probably the last debate of the cycle. It won't move any needles. But listen, if you're JD Vance, you got more of your lies out there, and the journalists sat there and let him do it.
Well, with that happy note about the state of American journalism, I'm going to call the clock on our live stream this morning. Frank Wilkinson, Nia Malika Henderson, you are both great columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. This was our weekly politics live stream. We'll see you next week, and thank you for joining us.